Welcome to our third and last section of Module 2. Here we discuss collaboration strategies. As mentioned in the previous section, being in a network of companies or developing an innovation network is really important. And there's different types of strategies and configurations that firms typically go about. This is an interesting case, and you can look that up. There's public records about that. It's called Sangano Biosciences. You've definitely heard about gene editing, and obviously one of those applications is to try to help people get more resilient against diseases or eliminate certain diseases completely. We're still kind of in the era of, you know, I would start at I would say at the beginning of this kind of trend. There's a lot of ethics issues associated with it. And so we'll have to see how things work out and what processes will be put in place to allow companies to do a bit more experimentation with these types of technologies without making things unsafe for people. Again, that we, like with many technologies, if you're in management, you won't know all the technical details, and I wouldn't ever expect you to do that in your project as well. The idea is really to understand kind of the basic functionalities, how they were developed, what's really kind of the core functionality, and how this functionality is better, different, and gives companies a competitive advantage. Here in this case, it's called zinc finger nucleases. I don't know if any one of you really has heard about this or knows what that is. I certainly don't necessarily know really much about that. But the idea is here they develop a technology with which they can actually edit genes of individuals, of a living individual. And you can imagine that is kind of a terrifying technology, but it also has a lot of potential. So you can imagine there's a lot of work associated with it, right? You need to do a lot of R&D work because you have to be very precise. You don't want to edit the wrong genes. And so they worked on this, and they essentially wanted to give people a mutation that would cure HIV and hopefully nothing else, right? And what often happens in these cases, right, especially when you have really powerful, potentially powerful technologies, you need a little time to develop them, right, to refine all these things. And so the problem for a company in that scenario is, where do you find the money? Who's going to give you the money for you or the money up front if you have a development cycle that's about 5 to 10 years? You've received, you know, there's a case study on QuantumScape. QuantumScape that develops these advanced battery systems for electric vehicles, and they have a similar problem, right? They have to finance their development, and so they have to kind of build a pool of investors that have a long view, but are also kind of demanding that there's going to be some progress. And so this is a case where Sangano, in this case, Biosciences, needs to find investors and or connect with other partners to kind of build this. And we've seen this as well, right? So when we think about cars, when we think about electric vehicles, when we think about how we want to build how we want to build smartphone technologies into cars, we will see quite a few partnerships emerge because no firm really has kind of the potential to do all of these together and finance that. Now, generally speaking, right, moving a little bit from Sangano, and again, you're welcome to do some research on them. I'm happy to post some links on what they've been doing. The question is, right, do I go solo? Do I build partnerships? Am I part of a network? And obviously, there's a couple of reasons to do so, right? If you're in typically, if you're in a very strong technological position, so let's say you pick Apple as the classic example, they were in a position to develop a smartphone, right? They had the engineering and R&D capabilities to do that. Obviously, they needed partners for manufacturing and kind of component design, but they wanted to keep that in-house. And Apple is one of those companies that tends to kind of build their own ecosystem, right? And you've been noticing that, right? Everything that comes from Apple is pretty well connected. It's very well synchronized. And so that has been a strategy of theirs for a very long time. You also want to protect your stuff, right? So if you build technologies that are way ahead, or at least significantly ahead of the competition, you want to make sure these things are protected, right? And patents aren't a perfect protection, right? They are one option to protect your technologies, and we'll talk about these in the upcoming modules. But there, it's important to decide: do I need to have exclusive control of the technology? Right, that's an important question, and so that's what firms have to kind of figure out before they kind of venture into collaborations. And right, as I kind of build up my capabilities, and I want to stay within kind of the frame of these capabilities, with the own frames of my company, it's important how other people also use these technologies, right? So if it's a military technology, if it's a gene editing technology, you don't just want to give that technology out to everybody or to partners freely without kind of having an idea of what happens with that technology, right? What are they going to use that for? Then obviously, right, when we think about that, there is a clear advantage of collaboration, right? And we know this on a team level or in other parts of our career. Having partners, finding partners to collaborate is important. I reduce my asset commitment, I increase my flexibility. I can learn from my partners, right? That's a really important factor. I can build common standards, right? So the more people I can bring into the boat, let's say I want to establish a standard, right? A technology standard. As this becomes more important for me, the question is how can I form an alliance around these things, right? So that's what is useful. Sometimes I don't have the skills and I don't have the resources, right? So we see that a lot where startups partner with bigger companies. One of the options, again, the case study on QuantumScape as an option for your final project kind of shows that, where you have a smaller startup partnering with a bigger company. And so the bigger companies, you have to kind of figure out how, what are the conditions and why am I doing this, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen kind of an ebb and flow of alliances, technology and research alliances. We've seen kind of a height in the mid-90s. And that's also partly because we've seen a lot of technological breakthroughs at that time, the internet being one of them. As kind of time passed, these alliances kind of ebbed off, and we see another spike around the 2007, 8, etc., is when the Internet of Things kind of started to become heavily commercialized, right? So most of the development we've had here, Amazon and other kind of providers kind of were built here. But then starting with the 2000s, we've seen a massive increase in Internet of Things applications. We have different types of collaborative arrangements. Some are more formal, some are more informal. One terminology that you've seen pretty frequently is a strategic alliance. And that can mean different things to different companies, depending whether they want to formalize that alliance, right, contractually, meaning that there are certain things that each partner has to do, or whether it's more of a loose informal coordinative alliance that is more about information exchange than really hard agreements that people can be held accountable for. And again, so it depends, right? So you can have bilateral alliances with different companies. You can also be part of a larger alliance, right? So you see this a lot with industry associations or trade associations. And you can have, again, like specific alliances between two companies. Something called a joint venture, and that's also considered a strategic alliance, but there's equity exchange, right? So for example, let's say Apple and one of the car manufacturers, they build a strategic alliance for autonomous vehicles, okay? That has happened in a few cases. And where, you know, both find, they build this venture, that's why it's called a joint venture, obviously. And so then there's all kinds of equity agreements and what this joint venture is going to do and who's going to make money off of it. And there's also intellectual property questions there that can get very complex, right? A lot of these joint ventures kind of fall through. But what's typically helpful is that through that joint venture, both companies learn a lot from each other, right? And so they take this information and they kind of use it then for their own capabilities. Some of these joint ventures, again, are successful. Most of them are not. But again, the main purpose here is to kind of retain information. Licensing, right? I mean, you've heard about it. You have a technology or you have, you know, a sort of intellectual property piece that you want to license to other people, right? There can be big companies licensing it to small companies and the other way around. There's a whole kind of sector of literature on licensing. Outsourcing, right? Typically, outsourcing has no equity involved, right? So you give somebody or you use somebody else to produce a part of your product. Boeing has done that with the 787. They've outsourced a lot. That was kind of a mix between a strategic alliance and an outsourcing agreement where different national partners, aerospace companies from different countries, essentially built different parts of the 787. The advantage was that Boeing didn't have to pay for the majority of the development costs. Some of the kind of disadvantages was that they had to assemble and they had to coordinate, and they had to make sure that the quality standards kind of comply with what Boeing needs to get that airplane certified. And then you have something else that's called collective research organizations. You've seen this also for autonomous vehicles. They've done a fair amount of these things. Where they kind of have these kind of more, I wouldn't say necessarily too formal, but you know, where they get a lot of people together to kind of openly share some insights about the topic. Then you have to think about, right? So how do firms make this arrangement, right? And again, you have to think not only about what type of collaboration, but also what type of firm you have. So let's say you take the first option of your final project and you kind of pick a technology that you're interested in or a patent that you're interested in, you want to develop it. You have to figure out, if I really care to kind of put this technology on the market, who could be potential partners for this endeavor, right? Is that government organizations? Is that other firms? Is that universities, for example, right? And so depending on how, what you want to do and how you want to do it and how large you are and how powerful you are or how much money you have as a firm or as an individual, maybe as an individual inventor, you have different configurations of collaborations here. Obviously, if you want to develop new competencies, right? You need to be a bit more committing, right? So you need to commit to partnerships that have usually equity involved. If you're interested in more developing, like improving on your existing competencies or in existing technologies, you might decide to do a few more, to engage in more loose collaboration strategies. So then, right, so we want to select a partner. How do we select our partner? What kind of resources do they have? How large are they? How powerful are they, right? How likely it is that they're gonna take those insights or potentially kind of copy some of our competencies or technology development competencies. And if they're a direct competitor, that could be problematic. Are the objectives and styles similar, right? So if you have very different cultures in the company and you're trying to form a joint venture, that could be difficult, right? Whether it's on the management level, on the manufacturing or engineering or sales level, right? So you have to figure out, like, both partners kind of have to want to do, or have to, they might want the same thing, but they don't have the same capabilities and they don't have the same collaboration cultures. Who profits from it, right? So let's say there is a competitive advantage coming from this partnership. Who's gonna mostly profit from that competitive advantage, right? Is it from A? Is it from B? Sometimes, it's okay if I get a smaller share of the cake, as long as I actually profit from this relationship. Anyway, so these are pretty complex questions, and they are not necessarily front and center of developing a technology, right? In terms of developing the technical capabilities of the technology. This is more for trying to improve the market position of technologies and to find kind of a adoption process, right? So how can my technologies be adopted in the marketplace? Well, finding a powerful partner can help me a lot doing that. And then if I'm engaging in a equity partnership, obviously I need to come up with contracts. I don't know if either of you have a law degree. I don't. And you can imagine that these contractual arrangements can be pretty complex, right? So that's why both, or a set of companies that want to engage in that have a whole barrage of lawyers who have to go through every single thing, right? What happens if information leaks? What happens if, resources are appropriated in a way that has not been discussed? What happens is if financing is withdrawn? Everything, right? Every possible scenario you can think of. That's important, right? And you want to monitor your partner, etc. If you, for example, build a supply chain relationship, you want to make sure that that supply chain partner is not taking the information that he gets, or that they get from your products or services, and give them to somebody else, right? So that's important. Again, there's all kinds of other options here. You have relational self-enforcing governance, goodwill, trust, reputation of partners, right? Sometimes they don't feel like making a contract because if they violate certain conditions, they will get a poor reputation, and that will kind of give them a worse position in the marketplace. Sometimes it helps if you're in a joint venture and you have shared ownership. It's very unlikely that one of the partners will try to tank the joint venture unless they have other plans or another strategy, etc. So this whole collaborative space has been quite interesting in the last 10, 20 years. And what has emerged is a term that's called open innovation. You might have heard the term before. Maybe you read a case study or an article. Maybe you talked about it in another class. Maybe they talked about it in your company. And the idea of open innovation is exactly that, right? Is that a company opens certain parts of its operations or R&D or strategy to outside parties, right? And the question is, how much should I open to do that, right? From where do I get my information, and what information do I want to share with other parties, right? And so this terminology of open innovation has been partly misunderstood, right? A lot of people mean that you're going to share all the intellectual property, that you're going to do share all the information with the public or outside parties, and that's not true, right? There are different levels of open innovation that every company can arrange. We talked about some of the tools, like these collaboration agreements, right? There's also another set of positions that we'll talk a little bit about that. So again, whether open innovation, right? To an extent, every company has to kind of interact with the outside world, outside of the company, right? And so the way they do it, or how much information transfer they want to engage with, is really depending on kind of their overall strategy and their kind of process that they want to follow. Different, again, we separate here between closed innovation and open innovation. The reality is there's kind of a middle ground between these two. But obviously, right, if you're more careful, or you're a little bit more closed, you typically want to own and protect your IP, right? Whether that's patents, whether that's trademarks or copyrights. Disney can be pretty aggressive. I don't know if you've seen some cases. They're protecting their copyrights, especially to their movies and their characters, very rigorously, right? There have been some cases where I think there was a high school or a university wanted to show one of their movies, and they kind of forbade it for them, or I think they even wanted to fine them for showing that. So different companies protect the intellectual property differently. So that's certainly a factor. And then kind of the idea of what are kind of metrics for open innovation, what are more metrics for closed innovation. Typically, when we think about market share, reduced time to market, increased margins, that's more related to open innovation. When we think about return on investment on R&D, when we think about breakthrough products or business models, that's typically related to open innovation. Again, it's not really the case. In reality, we have a mix of these, right? But just to show you that when we think about our innovation processes more openly, as a company, as a startup, as really any entity, there is some kind of different perspectives and views that can kind of influence us in either direction. Yeah, the reality is information is becoming more complex, right? The systems, innovation systems have become more complex. It typically is the case that a better business model always beats a better technology, right? So that's why we're going to talk about business models and business model innovation in the upcoming lectures. But the idea is really, it doesn't matter so much what technology you have, right? I mean, some technologies are more disruptive or more radical. Is what kind of business model do you build around them, right? So how do you actually package that technology to bring it to the marketplace? IP is a perishable asset. A lot of patents can be either re-engineered, or bigger companies can litigate against them, right? So that's not necessarily always the protection that you want. Customers and markets don't wait, right? So you're on the clock. As soon as you start committing resources to developing a technology, the importance is to kind of get it out there and generate revenue or profits in order to continue to develop it. It's becoming increasingly strategic about knowledge, right? And how to acquire and process knowledge. Do I often have enough people in my company, or are they, open enough, right? We talked about creativity and how routines can be kind of poison to creativity. And corporations tend to be, kind of strict, bureaucratic, efficient in a way to how to generate and to control markets, but not always the most efficient in developing technologies. And so having kind of an open innovation perspective helps you kind of expand your reach without necessarily committing too many financial resources, right? Again, you have to be kind of careful navigating that. It's not, you shouldn't be naive about it. But the idea is to be kind of strategic and understand when to share information, when to share knowledge, and when that makes sense, rather than, you know, trying to keep everything close to your chest. A technology that doesn't sell and doesn't get adopted is a liability, right? Because you spend a lot of money and you made some investments. So there is a transition you have to make. Again, this is pretty generic. You'll find a lot of these kind of pictures here. Electrolux, they do washing machines, as far as if I remember, but they actually have a pretty cool innovation network. They work a lot with universities, they work with customers and suppliers. And so they, again, to what extent, to what level they're open is always a debate. But they have actually shown some cool examples of how they're building their, how they're kind of putting smaller and larger innovations through their partners. This is kind of a really interesting field, right? So user innovation, user-based innovation, we've seen quite a bunch of, or also user-based content, right, to a degree. Think about memes, think about open source software, think about Wikipedia. That's a great example. Not all of these have to be for-profit operations, right? Reddit is another good example. Like every kind of entity that actively uses, that actively implements users to innovate, create content, build new ideas into the system. And then some applications. If you Google open innovation, you'll find a ton of different examples. And there's also a ton of different options, sorry. Google, like a lot of big companies, do these competitions. And what they typically do is we have this problem or we have this challenge. We invite everyone to provide solutions. And if your solution is selected, you can win such and such and such, right? And that can be leveraged by different types of organizations. Governments have done that. You have charities or nonprofit organizations that do that. A good example of open innovation is, well, open content, so to speak, is what's called open access. So I'm, as a professor, I have to publish, right? I have some publication requirements. And what used to be the traditional model is that you publish in a journal free of charge, and that the journal retains the copyright and then sells a subscription to universities or, you know, other organizations to access a bundle of journals, or a bundle of journals and a bundle of publications. That became increasingly expensive for universities, and so there have been a lot of kind of fights between the publishers and the universities and other organizations. And now there's kind of a new model where journals offer that you publish your article in that journal, but pay for it, right? So if you pay for the article, it's essentially becoming open, right? So you pay for the article to become open access, so that everyone in the public can essentially just Google the paper and they can download it, they can view it, et cetera, et cetera. They can't commercially exploit it without your explicit agreement, but it's accessible, right? And so that has been kind of an issue for a while. And so there's all kinds of configurations and really interesting circumstances, a lot of interesting applications that is certainly worth exploring. But unfortunately, here we have to close our last section of module 2. As always, I'll make sure to add some optional readings. So if any one of you wants to learn more about open innovation, you're welcome to do so. Again, we have 8 weeks and we kind of limited on what we can cover, and we have to cover quite a few things. So I apologize if I didn't go into more detail. But again, you'll get some more optional readings if you want to. And yeah, see you in the next module.